I focused on the life of a Yale alumnus named Simeon Baldwin, who graduated from Yale in 1781 and went on to serve a long career in local, state, and national politics. And exploring his complicated relationship with slavery, I learned that he both opposed slavery and was in many ways quite conservative. He understood slavery to be morally wrong, but he was unwilling to make personal sacrifices in the service of justice. So I'll try to briefly summarize Baldwin's biography and mention what I see as its resonance at Yale historically and in the present. And in particular, I'd like to discuss two major periods in his political engagement. First, his participation in anti-slavery advocacy in the 1790s, and second, his support for anti-Black policies in the 1820s and 30s in New Haven. So Simeon was born in 1761. He graduated from Yale in 1781, and he lived a long life, passing away in 1850 at the age of 89. And during his life, as I said, he held various local, state, and national political roles, including as a member of Congress from 1803 to 1805, as a judge on the Connecticut Supreme Court for about a decade, and as New Haven mayor in 1826. He came from a multi-generational Yale family, which was also a slave-owning family. His father, Ebenezer Baldwin, owned a child named Bristol, who's also called Bristow in some of the family's records. The Baldwins seem to have thought of themselves as benevolent participants in the system of slavery, although that's, of course, impossible. Despite its falsity, this myth of the gentle Northern master helps to explain, I think, how it was that Baldwin participated in anti-slavery advocacy, but did not reckon with his own family's slave ownership, or at least not publicly. And I think that this dissonance between stated principles and personal choices persisted throughout Baldwin's life, and that's what I'm hoping to explain today. After Baldwin graduated from Yale in 1781, he became involved in anti-slavery advocacy. The Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom and the Relief of Persons Unlawfully Holden in Bondage, formed in 1790. Then Yale President Ezra Stiles was the group's first president, and Baldwin was its first secretary. And the society met twice a year, once in New Haven just after Yale commencement, and once at the state capitol on election day. So in other words, the group really operated on the schedule of Connecticut's political elite. And its members, many of whom were Yale graduates, opposed slavery in principle, but maintained conservative positions as an organization on the correct way to end slavery. So this image is from a draft of a speech that Baldwin gave in 1792 to the Anti-Slavery Society, in which he described slavery as, quote, unjust, inhuman, impolitic, and unnecessary. But he also said, and this is the part that I underlined, that an immediate abolition of slavery is not to be expected, and therefore the society's objective should be merely to, quote, ameliorate the condition of enslaved people. So I think that this helps to show that Baldwin and his largely Yale-educated colleagues in this organization based their advocacy on what they felt was practical and not what they knew to be just. The Society for the Promotion of Freedom disappeared by 1800. Several of its Yale-affiliated members, including Simeon Baldwin, went on to prominent political careers. Baldwin, as I said, served in the House of Representatives and then on the Connecticut Supreme Court. And after leaving the court in 1818, he became a leader of New Haven's colonizationist movement. Colonizationists painted their cause as a humanitarian effort to send free Black people back to Africa. But they also warned that immediate emancipation and integration would destroy white society. There were some Black supporters of colonization, but many free Black people perceived colonization to be an effort by slave owners to protect themselves and their so-called property. Baldwin was not the only anti-slavery advocate turned colonizationist in his social circle. Others, including Yale Law School professor David Daggett, took similar paths from opposing slavery to actively restricting the rights of free Black people. And one major example of that is the opposition to the Black College that was proposed in New Haven. I know that at least one of the previous student presentations focused on the Black College proposal in 1831. And I'd like to discuss this event briefly as well, because I think it's a crucial illustration of Baldwin's commitment to protecting the status that he and his peers gained from a Yale education, and opposing Black freedom when he felt personally threatened by it. So at a New Haven town meeting on September 10th, 1831, 700 white residents of New Haven voted for resolutions in opposition to this proposed Black college, while just 4 supported the college. Baldwin and David Daggett, whom I mentioned, participated in the committee that drafted the resolutions in opposition to the college. And this image is from an article describing that committee's work. The resolutions against the Black College were motivated in part by fear that educated Black people would participate in the abolitionist movement. And in rejecting the Black College in 1831, I think that Baldwin joined the ranks of white elites who feared that white people would be forced to do more than merely condemn slavery in their words. And they recognized that slavery was a horrific institution, but they preferred to protect the power of slave owners over risk empowering a Black-led social movement. Baldwin worked throughout his life to maintain the privileges that Yale provided him and his family. And I think that this fact may help explain his stake in resisting the Black College, which was perceived as a threat to Yale's prestige and its alumni's power. Baldwin sent one of his sons to Yale, and 2 of his other sons were merchants who did not attend college, but really tried to use their family's Yale connections to their business advantage. I also think it's notable that in September 1831, which was the same month that Baldwin helped write the resolutions against the Black College, he organized the 50-year reunion of his Yale class. And it's striking that at the same time as he was working to preserve his Yale network, which was all white men, he helped to thwart the creation of an institution that would have facilitated a similar network for Black people. So I wanted to conclude by proposing a few connections between Simeon Baldwin's story and Yale today. This is an image of Yale's mission statement that's on the university's website. One thing that I looked into was Baldwin's participation in various societies at Yale as an undergraduate, including the Yale chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, and a group called the Society of Brothers in Unity, of which John C. Calhoun is arguably the most famous or infamous alum. This society was restarted in 2021, and I know that there are many groups on Yale's campus with controversial histories, and I am not intending to condemn the members of this particular group, but I think it's important to reckon with the histories of organizations on this campus and consider the motivation for continuing an organization to hang on to its prestige versus trying to create something new. And second, on a different note, Baldwin, as I said, was very aware of the immorality of slavery, but was also very invested in his son's merchant careers, which undoubtedly involves the trading of goods that were produced by or destined for plantations. And I think that there are echoes of this sort of individualistic mentality at Yale today, where students are expected to have a broad interest in improving the world, but there's also, I think, a culture of prioritizing individual wealth. All in all, I learned an enormous amount from participating in this research project and in the course, and I hope that the research into Yale's history with slavery will continue. I think there's certainly a lot left to uncover and reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. That was really awesome. Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm a senior in Jonathan Edwards College, and I was also in the course. And let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So my project is called Erasure in the Archives, 19th Century Washerwomen and the Yale Divinity School. So I was really interested in how the availability of materials in the archive of wealthy white men were very abundant in comparison to the often minimal and difficult to obtain materials on New Haven Black women in the 19th century. And I think that fact in and of itself reflects a belief in sort of what is worth remembering. Yale has a past that is riddled with selective preservation of institutional memory. And so the goal of my project was really to use Ann Goodman's story to begin the necessary conversation about asserting who gets to be in the archive, and then also asserting the value of voluntary financial contributions of Black women to the university. So in 1872, Mary Goodman, a formerly enslaved woman, became the first donor of color to Yale. Upon her death, Goodman donated her entire estate and $5,000 to the Yale Corporation. And in her will, she created a scholarship for the education of Black ministry students at Yale Divinity School. So this became the Mary Ann Goodman Scholarship. So there are a lot of questions here, right? How did a formerly enslaved Black woman get $5,000 in the 1870s? And did the corporation actually use the money in the way she intended? And then also, why did she decide specifically to donate to the Yale Divinity School when there are many other places that she could have left her money to? So Mary Ann Goodman was born in 1804 to Charles and Maria Brewster, and those were found through census data research. She married Bradley M. Goodman, who worked as a grocer. They lived on 43 Olive Street in Worcester Square. And he died in 1957 in New York. So from a letter from the Office of the Surrogate of New York, I found that they wrote to Mary upon Bradley's death, certifying that she inherited all of his goods and his belongings. So in her will, which is pictured on the left, she writes, "I desire that the income derived from the property, which shall come to said corporation under and by virtue of this will, shall be used in aiding young men in preparing for the gospel ministry, preference being always given to young men of color." And while this money was enthusiastically accepted by the corporation, it remains ambiguous as to whether the money was actually used in the way she intended. And one of the reasons I was kind of skeptical is because the corporation actually decided to erect the gravestone that's in the image on the right and bury her at Grove Street Cemetery, which was not included in instructions in her will. So I was sort of curious as to, whether they used this this gravestone as a symbolic gesture to kind of cover up the fact that maybe they didn't fully use the money the way she intended. So the next slide shows documents, or it should show documents about the way she acquired her money. Sorry, the images aren't coming through. It might be just because of Wi-Fi issues, but her sort of entrepreneurial background as a laundress reflects a larger pattern of Black business people in New Haven among the newly freed population after Connecticut completed their process of gradual emancipation in 1848. So Mary was a pillar in the New Haven community in the second half of the 19th century, working as a dedicated laundress, seamstress, and also a landholder, and she was really involved in her church. So there would be a map on the right showing where she had property on Carlisle Street that she leased out to emancipated Black people. And she also rented out rooms in her house in Worcester Square. And so then the image on the left was of receipts that I found in the archive from clientele of the items of clothing that she washed for them. And I was just sort of interested in what articles they were, because I think that can tell a lot about like who the clientele were. So it was dress shirts, pairs of cuffs, collars. And so I think the kind of higher status of clothes that she washed suggests that she had a relatively wealthy clientele. So after kind of compiling the information from Bradley Goodman's goods that he had, and then as well as the property that she leased out, and then her laundry business, that's kind of how she amassed her money. So in the 1830s and 40s, the Yale Divinity School was growing, and it kind of happened amid this backdrop of growing Black churches in the community, which I think is really relevant to why Goodman decides to donate her money there. But I also just wanted to kind of reaffirm that her story is just one in a long line of Black washerwomen in New Haven who did have connections to the Yale Divinity School, but I think have not been properly documented. So Hannah Gray on the right was a free Black New Haven woman who worked as a seamstress and a laundress. And it is very possible that they knew each other given their similar occupations and just similar involvement in local churches. So in 1860, Gray was estimated to have a real estate value of $1,200 and owned personal property that was worth $200 at the time. And she made these earnings primarily through her laundry and seamstress businesses, of which the Yale Divinity School was a frequent patron, actually, of her services. The school used her laundry services for at least 10 years in the 1850s. And so what's really interesting here is that although Gray's support for the Yale Divinity School came before the Goodman Scholarship donation in 1872, Goodman is actually officially recognized as the first Black donor to Yale, I think in part because her contribution went to the institution as a whole, whereas Gray supported individual students. And then I also think the size of the contribution is a reason why that maybe Goodman's donation was documented as the first as opposed to Gray's. So on the left, the image isn't showing up, but it should be the annual circular, which is just like a document that explains the room and board for the students and like tuition fees, and it covers all of the sort of like logistical information. So it said that students who already received board assistance in their payments would have their washing done free of charge. So the thought is that Goodman was hired by the university like Gray. Unfortunately, like tangible employment records were not in the folder that I was looking in. But the thought is that she worked for the university. So then the next thing I wanted to see was who were the first Black divinity students, right? And they were supposedly the beneficiaries of Goodman's donation. So the first Black divinity students were Solomon Coles and James W.C. Pennington. Both were formerly enslaved. James Pennington was at the Yale Divinity School in the 1830s prior to Coles, but he could not formally enroll. He was told to sit in the back of the classroom, could not speak, and really was just able to audit classes. So he never received a degree from the Divinity School. There's also no specification in Goodman's will for how long the funds would support a student's education. So it's possible that Coles only received the scholarship for his first year. And so one other thing that's interesting is that modern records of the recipients also don't explicitly state whether they received it each year of their education at the Divinity School. But the timeline does work out for Coles to have received the money from the scholarship. She died in January 1872, and Coles entered in September 1872. But there are no financial documents available for Coles' acceptance or application materials that suggest his application or that suggests his education was supported by the scholarship. So there's still a little bit of ambiguity, and I think like the ambiguity in itself speaks to my larger question of like how do we remember things in the archive and who gets remembered. So Coles was the first Black student to formally enroll in the Divinity School. And then I wanted to look at recent recipients of the scholarship and how this legacy is being remembered, and then who is currently benefiting from it. So in 2016, which there's sort of an image on the left, the Mary Goodman Circle of Donors was founded as a cumulative donations group to kind of continue the legacy. And I just thought it was interesting that the timing of when it was created, as well as also there's a lack of like an educational aspect to the circle. So that kind of made me a little bit hesitant, thinking that maybe donors might not necessarily be fully aware of Goodman's story. And so the timing was in 2016, which was the same year that the Yale Divinity School created the James Pennington classroom, actually. And they have a portrait of him in this classroom dedicated to him. And then 2016 was also like amid when the university was facing a lot of backlash, and there was a lot of kind of political chaos on campus amid the election. And they also had the 2015 racial tensions around the renaming of John Calhoun College. So you have a lot of things happening external to the Yale Divinity School that may have influenced the creation of certain honors or dedications, which I think is really interesting. So the next piece of sort of this legacy is the naming of the new colleges. Yale Divinity School alumni group fought really hard in 2017 for the new colleges to be named after Mary Goodman. There are currently Benjamin Franklin and Pauli Murray colleges. And then, so that request was kind of not explicitly denied. It just, like, the excitement around that movement kind of settled down. And then on the right is Jonathan Tolles, who was the most recent recipient of the scholarship that I could find. He received it in 2016. And I think there is generally a lack of transparency regarding how Goodman Scholarship recipients are selected. And then also a lack of easily accessible record of past year's recipients, which I think in some ways undermines Goodman's very intent of amplifying the visibility of Black divinity scholars. So just this last piece about what the university can sort of do moving forward, I think would be to incorporate an educational component into the Mary Goodman Circle of Donors, make more transparent the process by which Goodman scholars are selected, and then make more readily available the list of recent recipients of the scholarship. But what distinguishes Goodman, I think, from other donors of the time period, beyond the obvious like identity distinguishing factors, that since the donation came at the end of her life, she wasn't able to see what became of it. And there are likely several people like Hannah Gray and Mary Goodman in Yale's history who serviced the university and contributed to it financially, but are under-recognized. So using this sort of through line of memory and preservation of the archive, I sort of identified the university's priority that preserves certain narratives over others and also sheds light on Mary Goodman's story, whose contributions have never before been considered at this length, to my knowledge. So I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you all so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Nicole. Yeah, I just wanted to start by expressing gratitude to be in this space and for all of you who are listening and the chance to have participated in what was a really, really amazing class taught by Professor Feemster and Professor Rugemer and Tianu Reed last semester. And listening again to all of my peers' research and learning about these parts of the history of Yale have really changed the way that I move through campus, and sharing them with my peers. I think it kind of shows how important the sort of contemporary effect of history can be, and knowing that history. And so, yeah, I hope that this research continues. But as Michael introduced, I'm actually a painter and I'm completing my MFA at the School of Art. So I'm not an official historian in the way that a lot of my classmates and peers are sort of able to perform history in a more traditional way. I wanted to kind of walk through both the research that I did for this incredible class, but also note that I'm going to be presenting it very much through a a painter or an artist's lens. Great. Let me just play this. So before I do that, I wanted to quickly introduce you to some of the key questions that I'm always considering in my painting practice, which is really focused on questioning the sort of existing epistemological hierarchies which we occupy and which institutions like Yale have historically enforced. So that's basically thinking about what is considered knowledge, what are considered good ways to know, and who are the bodies or the people who are considered capable of knowing. Doing that questioning involves, at least for me, working very much from a place that's grounded in Black feminism and queer theory. And two of the texts that I sort of guiding lights in my practice are Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic and Amber Jamila Musser's text that's called Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity and Brown Jouissance. But her particular notion of brown jouissance is something that I think about often. And for this project and for this class in particular, because it involved extensive archival research, I was also extremely dependent on the framework of critical fabulation, which is sort of outlined by Saidiya Hartman. So I'm just gonna jump right into the research. So in 1718, Elihu Yale, a former governor with the East India Company, he was actually the governor of Madras. So in this painting on the right in the back, that's actually a painting of the port of Madras, which is present-day Chennai in India. So Mr. Elihu Yale sent a large donation to what was then the struggling collegiate school of Connecticut. His donation, which consisted of books, a painting, and goods, are what was used to secure the future of the school and established Yale College. This was also the largest donation that the university would receive for over a century. So it's not an insignificant donation, in addition to the fact that it obviously led to the naming of the university as such after him. So the 300 volumes of books that he shipped can still be accessed in Yale University Library today. A lot of them are at the Beinecke, hence the image of the Beinecke on the right, while the painting of King George I, which is on the left, has been carefully conserved by Yale University Art Gallery. So I'm thinking about this as a three-part donation: the books, the painting, and the goods. And within these three parts, the first two parts are very much preserved by the university, used and considered understandable or legible forms of knowledge, and so, things of value. However, despite being the most valuable component of the donation, very scarce records were made or maintained of the goods. This is the part of the donation that I really focused on. The records that do survive clearly indicate that Mr. Yale's donation actually had no cash, gold, or jewels, sort of things that we would traditionally now think of as a donation that one would make to a university in terms of money. The invoice here is in manuscripts and archives and was basically the only primary source which describes the goods in the donation. It's an account of the sale of the goods, because the goods, after they were received, were sold. This work of mine, which I did, is actually an embroidered sort of facsimile of the invoice from manuscripts and archives. This is a detailed look at the embroidery work. So if Mr. Yale's donation was not money or gold, what did it consist of? It turns out that it consisted specifically of 1 case of soy sauce, 2 jars of mango chutney, a jar of nutmeg, and 3 bales of various textiles. I did a lot of research because the manuscripts and archives invoice, or account that I showed earlier, that document details a list of the types of textiles. And I did research and discovered that almost all of them had likely been hand woven by weavers in India, depending on the type of textiles they were. That is where a majority of those textiles were being manufactured or made at that time. Furthermore, all these items were sold in the port of Boston by 1721. And the one surviving document that we have is an account of that sale. It does not say who they were sold to. However, again, based off of the research of how this type of textile circulated in the sort of global market at this time, it was primarily valued not because it was being used or worn by European or sort of colonialist people, but although some of it may have been sold to people like local wealthy New England families, a majority of it was likely sold to slave traders in the port of Boston, who went on to exchange them for captives in West Africa. So it's interesting to think that the money from their sale was acquired through this sort of participation in the transatlantic slave trade. And that's the same money that went on to sort of secure the future of Yale University. This is the full installation which emerged out of this research for me. And in this, I sort of attempt to recreate the donation that founded this university with a particular focus on the parts of the gift that have not been discussed, studied, or preserved. The process, as I've outlined for you, included extensive archival research, sort of thinking about what are the different terms that were used for fabric at different times, what are the different methods of manufacturing or making that fabric, what are the different materials involved in that, as well as what were the conditions of the weavers, which were affected very, very long term, specifically by a lot of the policies that Elihu Yale implemented while he was the governor of Madras. So this has had both like sort of the cloth that came to support Yale is very much a material evidence of a lot of the colonial policies that came to be in India and sort of affect the way in which cloth is produced in the country today. And furthermore, sort of what we consider to be the legacy of our university and our knowledge, and why is it that we don't think about ourselves as a university formed from cloth. In order to make the work, I also hand wove the entire donation on a loom. And so the sort of installation was accompanied by a sound piece, which I wanted to play briefly. And the sound piece really overlays recordings of the loom on which I was weaving the different types of cloth. So the different types of cloth that you see here are sort of my imagined versions in terms of color and things like that, but informed materially very much by the description of the cloth in the archive. Which again is the centerpiece of this particular work. And you can hear how the loom sounds really different when you're weaving the muslin versus the calico versus the poplin. Hopefully you can get a kind of sense of a different sound of what the history of Yale could be.
Coat of many fibers. Out of the red earth and the black earth grew the white cotton, and then came black and brown fingers picking it. In the kerosene-lighted shadows of the evening shack, the fingers wove a long cloak of cotton. With a line of blood, a thread of weeping and moaning, a strain of song, a streak of tears, and a grasp on the white fiber, the fingers spun a hymn to God.
चरखा चाले पांच तत्व गुण कीनी वो चादर जीनी धन जीनी हो चरखा चाले पांच तत्व गुण कीनी वो चादर जीनी धन जीनी हो
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhasha, Nicole, and thanks also to Abby. I have a couple questions, but I was really tremendously moved and energized and inspired by all three of your presentations and seeing the place in New Truths. I want to hold on to an extraordinary line that I think I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life, Bhasha, of a university formed from cloth. And as you said that, I was struck that it actually resonates, and there's a line, a thread, excuse if I may say that, from what Nicole was saying and Mary Goodman and others, Hannah Gray, who were washers of cloth. And so there's also, I think, a direct, and so I wanted to offer both thanks for those threads that you've both offered us and the resonances, but invite each of you to respond to the others, however you might, whether it's praise for the other, reactions in the moment that you might have had in your own thinking, hearing these two presentations, seeing them side by side, I find very generative, and I wanted to just offer space to each of you to respond, react to each other's presentations. Nicole, if I might invite you first.
Yeah, absolutely. Bhasha, that was really cool. And I thought it was so impressive how you made the installation yourself. I think a lot of times people, it kind of relates to what I was saying about just things people don't know about the university and the creation, because you hear a lot on tours, or these prospective students are told on tours about Elihu, Yale's donation, and I don't think that the textile piece is really covered in that. And I think that's really, I don't know, I just thought your presentation was so interesting.
Thank you, Nicole. Bhasha.
Yeah, thank you so much. I similarly felt the cloth resonance is a really interesting one that you brought up, Michael. I mean, I think that there is a thread around, just for us as students at Yale, sort of unraveling this history is a simultaneous sort of unraveling in a lot of the contradictions that one feels in the institution as we move through it in the present day. And I think like Abby showed that sort of mission statement of Yale University versus thinking about the way in which a lot of the clubs and organizations, or even the rhetoric, kind of functions on campus. And so that's definitely something that I'm always thinking about. And in Nicole's presentation, absolutely, about like reading, I mean, I love the way that Nicole sort of is reading these washerwomen, the laundry receipts, you know, and the particular types of clothing. And that's sort of the point that I was trying to think about in terms of what is considered knowledge, what is considered part of Yale's history. And, you know, these receipts happen to be in manuscripts and archives, but I'm sure very few people have actually considered them to be part of Yale's history. So what does it mean for us to be sort of reading that, whether it's the laundry receipts or whether it's these lists of fabrics that were sent by Elihu Yale, and saying like, this is actually what founded the university, or what has sort of strengthened the university, not necessarily the sort of the names of the presidents or the founders that we usually talk about.
I wanted to ask both of you that just touched, Nicole, you talked about students coming on tour, or prospective students, and Bhasha, you talked some about your fellow students in the School of Art. I just wonder what, sort of informally conversations and you two and your colleagues in the class are catalysts on campus for these conversations, not just in the classroom, but amongst your peers. But what kind of reactions when you've shared over the course of the last semester and into this semester, whether it's the story of Mary Goodman, the work, Bhasha, with your fellow students in the School of Art, what sort of things you've been hearing and what kind of conversations among contemporary students as it relates to Yale and slavery do you see and have you catalyzed?
I'll go first just to change it up. I was thinking very much about, I think what I was saying earlier about the way in which I navigate the space, I meant that almost literally. I mean, I think that there's this sense of walking around campus, which we're lucky to be doing again since the COVID sort of pandemic is slowly passing through us, or we're passing through it differently. And so there's this idea of walking by a building or an intersection and being like, did you know this story about this particular place? Like, and I think as part of the class, we did a sort of almost like a walking tour around the sort of central 9 squares of New Haven. And that was a really interesting way that helps you remap the history into a geographical space. I think that it's interesting to think of if like the Yale tour itself could incorporate those moments of New Haven history, which is Yale history, into that. Because I think, yeah, you kind of, what you remember about a college is often through its buildings, through its monuments, and through the stories that you've heard about what happens in each of those places. And there's a completely different history in all of Yale's buildings that is sort of like the subaltern history, which really is the foundation of it.
Thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that. I think the physical space really shapes how we experience the university, but then also like my project was about a graduate school, and I think that there's a lot of space between the undergraduates and the graduate students, and that there's not a lot of like communication or knowledge necessarily that happens. And so I thought it was really important, at least among like my peers, and just kind of like starting a conversation of like, what are these graduate schools, and like where, how are they built, and things like that. Because I think, again, going back to the prospective student thing that I was saying, is that we're told a lot about Yale College, but I think that there's a lot to be unpacked still with the graduate schools.
Right. And I wanted to, Bhasha, celebrate your taking this class as a student in the School of Art. You may have known last semester, we had the great Kentura Davis present her work on the Mondays at Beinecke, and Kentura is a recent alum who, like you, was explored and made the most of all of Yale. And I also just wanted to say, I think we can count you as a historian, maybe a weaver and an artist of history, and there are others who are writers or typists or digital makers. But and Nicole, I hope you would agree that we can account Bhasha certainly within the historian realm. A number of people had questions, and I wanted to use it as a prompt to each of you about your specific sources. So if you could talk, and I think, Nicole, if you might speak a little bit more, where literally exactly what collection those receipts are in. Bhasha, you talked some of working in MSSA and the archives. So I wonder if each of you might speak a little bit more specifically about the archives you used. And then also from your own experience as students and working in the archives, many people in our audience are not many are practiced in working in archives, but many are not. So for those of us who are new to archives, if you might have a tip or a problem that you ever overcome, but share some experience for the benefit of others. So a little bit about specific archives you worked in, and then also how you've honed your own archival practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, so I used the manuscripts and archives in Sterling Memorial Library, and I looked at treasurer records from the window was 1700 to 1963, but I narrowed that down based on the decade that I was looking in. And then I also looked at Franklin B. Dexter, who was the secretary of Yale at the time of the donation. So I looked at those records to see if there was any communication between the Yale Corporation and Mary Goodman. I found the laundry receipts in the secretary of the Yale University records. And then I also used Ancestry a lot for census information, to figure out where they lived. And the housing records as well were also on ancestry.com. And then a couple of the challenges I had with just really old documents was reading them and making sense of them. I think the script is kind of hard to parse through if you're not familiar with that kind of formal handwriting. And then I think a lot of the times, because they're really old documents, they're faded. So it's just kind of hard to really make sense of what they're saying.
Thank you. Bhasha.
Yeah, I used manuscripts and archives as well. Even if you don't have if you happen to be a Yale student, or if you happen to have access to the Yale manuscripts and archives or any sort of archival research, I highly recommend it. There's a big section of my paper that I wrote for this class was actually just about the sort of experience of moving through that space and what the material of the archive looks like. There's also something incredible about doing archival research that's still paper-based, in these boxes. And I just want to share this small story about how I stumbled across this project, which was completely on accident. I'm from Hawaii, and I was doing research on the original missionaries that were sent to Hawaii to teach quilting, and a lot of them had actually been sent by Yale University. So a really strange coincidence, and I had requested a particular box, and either through a typo that I entered into the system or something that happened on their end, I was sent the wrong box. And the box that I opened up happened to have this invoice with these list of sort of cloth types in it. And I was like, what is this? What's going on? And I stumbled upon a completely different sort of type of, or different research question or a different history to delve into. And then another big part of my research definitely came from oral histories. It came from my weaving teacher at Divinity in Delhi in India, who explained to me, how to weave these different types of cloth, the different types of expertise that went into that. So I think it's bringing together different types of knowledge, whether that's the paper, amazing paper, you can touch these invoices from the 1700s that are just sitting in the library. It's crazy. And then also, the stories that we tell each other, the stories that we have in our families, start talking about how all those histories are interconnected with sort of what's preserved officially in a library. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both for those, both the practical insights as well as the broader thoughts that you offered. And of course, as it relates to the paper archives, there's further resonances and threads, since oftentimes, cotton and rag paper and all that. So maybe when we have you back, we can go down, talk about those issues. Number of people asked, and I think Nicole and I probably have the same question, Bhasha. When, where is your installation? And are there ways to see other images of it if it's not up now? And is there an afterlife for the installation? So if you could just talk some about that.
Of course, yeah, that the images I showed you were part of my thesis show in the MFA program, which just happened in January and February. So it's come down this month, but I imagine it very much as a proposal that I have for like a public art project or something that could maybe potentially live in a library or in an institution at Yale. So if anybody has any resources to help me realize that, that is sort of what I'm focusing on now, how to kind of even propose this as a project that can have a longer life and be a way to tell Yale's history within a space at Yale.
Question, Nicole, from an audience member. Is there more known about Goodman's husband? And then I would add also, do we know her family, both her ancestors, and were there any children, and sort of further to the Mary Goodman and her family?
Yeah, so they have no heirs, Bradley and Mary. They didn't have children, which I think is maybe another reason why she decided to donate to the Divinity School. If you think about the relationship that she had with her church, and also just like being really involved with kind of the young Black people in her church space, she might have been inspired by them to maybe want to see them go forth and attend YDS. And then in terms of Bradley's family, I don't know much about him. I was really interested in what his relationship was like with Mary. And so I think that aspect could definitely be looked into more. And I do know that he lived in New York for a brief period of time because he's listed as living in Manhattan according to the 1829 census in New York. But then in the 1840, like New Haven City Directory, he's listed as living here. So I would be really curious to know more about Bradley. I think I don't know much more about Mary's parents other than that her father was a retired laborer and her mother was a domestic cleaner.
Great. Wanted to ask if you could reflect some on the class, and both of you noted that it was important for learning and reconceptualizing. If there's other, Abby raised the wonderful issue and stories of colonization and important things to remember, the anti-slavery conservatism, and how there were many leaders who might have been against the institution of slavery, but still participated in white supremacy. I wonder if either of you might share some other topics that your peers were working on that inspired you, that were new to you, and things that you might offer up for our audience themselves to think about going out to learn more. So what are some things perhaps that you learned that you would share and encourage others to on their own go and learn more about in the area of Yale and New Haven and Connecticut and slavery and its aftermaths? Nicole, if I might turn to you first.
Yeah, of course. That's a really good question. I think one of the other projects in the class was on Yale's Civil War Memorial in Woolsey Hall. And I believe Mackenzie did one of these presentations at Mondays at the Beinecke back in January, but I just was really fascinated by that project because I think I don't know, at least for me, I walk through that building every day and I had never really noticed the walls before with the engravings. And I think that that's definitely something to think about in terms of how Yale played this role in wanting to make peace essentially, and who's, when we think about whose side that Yale takes on things and what their role is in making political statements, I think is really important. But I think just a general takeaway from the class is that there's always more to learn and to just be critical of the things you hear firsthand, especially I think when there is so much history and there's a lot of covering up of narratives that tends to happen to preserve reputation and preserve image. I think just to always be questioning is something that I have taken away from this class.
Thank you, that was beautiful. Bhasha.
Yeah, I think one of the other specific research projects that stood out to me was Donasia's work on the historic Black college that was proposed, that would have been, if it had come to be, the sort of first Black college in the United States, and the fact that, you know, there was a specific place chosen for it, and all those the sort of implications of Yale University in shutting that down are really damning, and really sort of makes one ask, like, at what cost are we receiving the education that we are receiving today? And I think it also, through the class generally, even like Abby's project, and it kind of showed that to me, is that a lot of the power that Yale has is through its students. And I think that that's something that that shouldn't be forgotten, or shouldn't be forgotten by us, you know, as students, that there isn't this notion of the administration and then us as necessarily completely two different bodies. And so how is it that we can maybe utilize that in a really different way than it has historically been utilized, the power of being a Yale student? What are the sort of obligations that comes with, and how can we sort of wield that to a space of justice rather than what we've seen historically happen?
Thank you, Bhasha, for those comments, and both of you for those comments. Couple quick program notes. Next Monday, the Mondays at Beinecke will feature two great scholars and practitioners from the School of Drama, Eric Glover and Ashley Thomas, who will be speaking about Lorraine Hansberry in connection with the current exhibition here at Beinecke Brava, Women Make American Theater. So I hope many of you will be able to join us. All of these talks are archived and published on the Beinecke YouTube channel. So this talk will be published within a week or so, and previous episodes can be seen on YouTube on the Beinecke YouTube channel, as well as many other talks that have been given in the conference for Yale and Slavery from the Gilder Lehrman Center. You can access on a playlist off of the Beinecke YouTube channel. There are many comments of praise, which I would co-sign and echo and uplift. Excellent research and presentations. I just wanted to say how utterly inspiring these three projects and the presentations about them have been. Wonderful, many exclamation points. So the audience joins me in thanks. And I wanted to close by posing a prompt to each of you. And I think you've touched on these, so you could continue, you could repeat things you've said already. But the question in the prompt is by way of this. You know, it's been said that history may not repeat, but it rhymes. And if you think about the present day, and I think, again, you've touched, both of you, on this, but why does this matter? Whether it's the particular work that you did for our community and our society now, or generally the work of the Yale and Slavery class and the Yale and Slavery Research Project. So I wonder if you could just speak and offer some words, perhaps of benediction, to close us out and send us off, of the importance and relevance of this work, your work, for the world in which we live, and perhaps for repairing the world in which we live. Bhasha, if I might turn to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if my answer is going to be very different from the last thing that I was talking about. I think that there is something to be said about that the power of the institutions that we hold, whether that's Yale, whether that's the country that we live in or the city that we live in, often comes from our presence in them and our voice and our actions, individually or collectively. And there are many collectives. There isn't just a sort of singular voice. And so being able to sort of bring out the nuances within what appears to be a sort of cohesive voice or a cohesive body, and always being aware of the sort of the multiple positionalities. I think that complicating what is a simple narrative is inherently the first step to sort of not covering, but revealing, and not continuing to live in tears and disrepair, but beginning to mend without erasing sort of what is a very important and violent history.
Thank you. Nicole.
Yeah, I agree with everything Bhasha said, and I'll just add on to say that I think this work matters because of accountability and the importance of keeping schools like Yale and Yale accountable. I think that because there is so much history there, I think that it's important that that doesn't get lost with the new class of Yalees that keep coming in, and so much continues to change and to happen on this campus. And I think that a lot of the older aspects of it can get lost when I think we're just going through the day-to-day, or even just, I know around election time, like a lot flares up on campus, but I think it's important to not recognize those as just isolated incidents, but look at the really long contingent historical ways that we've sort of come to exist on this campus and in this current moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you each. Thank you all. Thank you both. Thank you, Abby. And on behalf of the nearly 200 people who've signed in today and those who no doubt will watch the archived recording of this on YouTube, thank you for the brilliance of the light that you are shining on the truth. Thank you. Have a blessed day.